Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we talk with a representative of a Jewish organization that advocates for Jewish interests in Europe. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwestern town Elgin, Illinois. It was not a community of Holocaust survivors. Our parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. And yet, in September 1970, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, and this changed our lives forever.
Alex Benjamin is the director of the European Jewish Association in Brussels. He has worked for the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and he has worked in the European Parliament as a political advisor and communications director. His tasks involve directing campaigns, liaising directly with key EU figures, and generating positive outcomes for the association's membership. Alex, it's wonderful to have you on our show. Welcome.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Alex, could you tell us briefly about the overall mission of the European Jewish Association?
Sure. The European Jewish Association exists primarily, and its first function is to instill a positive Jewish experience in Europe, to make Jews feel proudly Jewish, to feel proud of their identity, and to contribute as well to, as we have over millennia, to the cultural, civic, economic fabric of whichever countries that we live in. That's the overarching mission. We also deal with, for instance, rabbinical support. We combat anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We bring politicians and key opinion formers in diplomatic circles, not only to Israel, but we also regularly brief them on matters of concern to our communities across Europe. We have hundreds of communities that we represent in Europe. And we also speak directly and engage with journalists to ensure that not only Israel, but that Jewish matters get a fair and balanced hearing within the media. That's basically our mission in a nutshell.
Okay.
When did this organization start, and what was the reason for it? I mean, who came up with the idea?
It was actually Rabbi Menachem Margolin, who comes from a Chabad Lubavitch background. He's originally from Kfar Chabad in Israel, and he came to Brussels, must be about 12, 13 years ago now, and he could see that there was a need for this association. There are other Jewish associations or Jewish groups within the sort of European bubble, if you like, but no overarching pan-European one that deals specifically with these issues. And as is often the case, I'm sure both of you ladies are familiar with Monty Python's Life of Brian. There's this concept of, there's this great scene rather, where Brian is trying to get involved with a sort of this Jewish sort of freedom fighters, and they say, "You, the People's Front of Judea," and they expletive, "No, we're the Judean People's Front." So there's an element of that goes on in Europe as well, that some people didn't feel represented by the existing bodies. So we stepped into that gap, and thank God. We've been able to grow year on year, and more communities are coming into our fold, and our advocacy efforts have grown exponentially. I remember when I first joined, it was Menachem and the secretary drafting letters. We're now a team 15, 16 people spread out across Europe with a team in Israel as well. So we're very, very busy. Of course, in an ideal world, would be out of business, but we don't live in an ideal world.
So now can you give us an overview of what you're seeing in Europe in terms of rising anti-Semitism there?
Sure. So in terms of anti-Semitism, you're right, it's rising. We saw a kind of high watermark during the pandemic of what we can call, for want of a better word, old-fashioned anti-Semitism, where Jews were responsible for the pandemic. We saw the old tropes coming out of, it used to be us poisoning the well, or Christian children, or blood in the matzah, and that was basically just replaced with a virus. The biggest growth is in AntiZionism, which is really, really very, very concerning. And I'm going to touch upon something else briefly, which is not direct anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism per se, but laws and legislation coming from more progressive voices, which make Jewish life in Europe impossible. But maybe we can come into that in a bit more detail. I will say that an Iron Curtain, the old Iron Curtain, you mentioned that you were living in Munich 25 or so years ago. So of course you probably remember 25 years after the war. Sorry. So you probably remember the wall being up. That curtain still exists in terms of anti-Semitism. I'll try and explain. In former Eastern and Central Europe, what was behind the curtain, you still have a lot of what I would call, or what might make sense to you for an American audience, deep South anti-Semitism. I'll try and explain that. That's the kind of Jews have a lot of money, Jews control the media, Jews are inherently wealthy, the kind of stuff that you still see in Poland, where in a lot of Polish houses they have a rabbi which they rub to bring good luck and gold into the house. Dolls. This kind of anti-Semitism that is born from literally millennia of wrong perceptions about Jewish people. Then in the more Western countries, where conversely you have a lot more migration, you're seeing anti-Zionism. The old forms of anti-Semitism are still there, but they're being dwarfed by anti-Zionism. Very, very brief example: the Yellow Vests protest in Paris. There was a Jewish philosopher, a guy called Alan Finkielkraut. He was stopped in the street and called a dirty Zionist. Now, the people that yelled at him picked their words very, very carefully, because it's against French law to call somebody a dirty Jew. That's punishable. That's an offense. You can be thrown in jail for that, but you can't be thrown in jail presently for calling somebody a dirty Zionist. Now, you and I both know, all three of us know as Jews that calling somebody a Zionist and a Jew is the same thing. It's just passing words. We both clearly understand what that means, but there's a problem there anyway. So that's basically where we're at right now. Obviously, social media is a problem, but we're working with a lot of social media companies to change that. We're also working with key opinion formers here. For instance, the equivalent of your Deborah Lipstadt in the States is Katharina von Schnurbein here.
She's been on our show.
Oh, right. Okay. So you know Katharina, and she's doing great work, but it's a slow, laborious process. I mean, you have 50 states, we have 27 member states, and there are some parts that are affected by European law and other parts that aren't. So it's a very, very messy picture. But we're trying our best. But sometimes it feels, and hopefully this is an analogy that Evelyn can understand. Sometimes it feels like there's a story of a little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike trying to stop the flood. And sometimes it feels like that all we're trying to do is contain the flood by sticking our finger in this dike.
Yeah, it's a constant river of incidents. Where is this anti-Semitism coming from in Europe? Is it coming from the far right, from the far left, from the Muslim population, from everybody? How
I mean,
would you
it's
how
the
would
latter.
you describe that?
I would describe it almost as a perfect storm of
Mm.
anti-Semitism. You know that film, or you know the concept of a perfect storm. So you've got the far right, which is predominantly that old-fashioned deep South anti-Semitism, if you want to call it that. Then you have the far left, which is rabidly anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, which is finding common cause perversely with the far right. Throw into the mix progressive elements who are making Jewish life, because they regard Jewish practice, particularly on kosher slaughter and circumcision, as archaic and barbaric. You throw that into a legislative mix, and concepts, modern concepts such as intersectionality, and it's really a very, very difficult environment. We're fighting on all fronts, is the honest answer. And of course, you've seen a large influx of migrants coming from Middle Eastern countries, places like Syria, who have brought their own metaphorical as well as physical baggage in terms of a cradle to the grave anti-Semitism which they've been inculcated with, and that's having an effect in Europe as well, in an increase in marches, in anti-Israel marches, and in attitudes towards Jews. I mean, can I just give you a very, very brief example? Austria did a survey on Muslim attitudes generally as part of their plan for combating anti-Semitism. And I came across this figure today because we've got a guy working with us who spent the last 2 days going through all of the national plans which some of the countries are trying to combat anti-Semitism with. 69% of Muslims in Austria believe that if Israel didn't exist, there would be peace in the Middle East. So if Israel is eradicated, this is a magic bullet and everything is fine in the Middle East. That's only shared by 11% of the overall Austrian population, by the way, but it gives you an indication. And we're hearing a lot. I mean, you're talking about Holland or the Netherlands. You've got people like Rabbi Benjamin Jacobs, the chief rabbi there, people like Ellen van Praag, the chairwoman of IPO, who are really increasingly alarmed that moderate, tolerant countries like Holland are becoming no-go places for Jews because of this combination of far right, far left, increasing migration. Holland is not the country that it used to be for Jews, and it's a great shame. And we're seeing this across the board. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Could you share also with our audience, Alex, some specific examples of anti-Semitism and what the European Jewish Association has done to confront these instances?
Sure. So, I mean, there's countless examples. There are countless examples. So let me give you one, for instance. During the pandemic, we suddenly saw in Germany stickers appearing on the Cologne and Berlin underground with the coronavirus, you know, that famous sort of circle with the various points going off it, with a Magen David, the Star of David, in the middle of it. And we had to engage the German government on that specific issue. And the German government adopted a zero tolerance attitude towards it, which resulted in some criminal convictions. So, I mean, there are countless examples. Day in, day out, I'm dealing with examples of anti-Semitism online. I mean, I could go on and on. What I would like to do briefly is talk about some of the examples which aren't direct anti-Semitism, but that we're having to fight as well. So I had to go to Iceland, of all places, because Iceland was going to make circumcision a criminal offense. 6 years in prison for circumcision. So I had to go over there. Now, there was no malicious anti-Semitic intent behind that legislation. In fact, I made a joke up there when I met the foreign minister. I said, listen, I know things are cold up there and you might need every layer you can get, but to criminalize it is perhaps going a bit too far. Incidentally, when I was trying to explain to him the process of circumcision, he sat during the entirety of a meeting with his legs crossed and his hands over his crotch. But the serious point is that other countries copy, particularly Nordic countries, they tend to copy each other, and they put the primacy of children's rights or animal rights above freedom of religion. And freedom of religion is a central pillar on which European values are built upon. And they're trying to erode these pillars. The anti-Semites, in a sense, we can deal with. We know what anti-Semitism is, and we can deal with that. What we're trying to educate as well in places like Iceland or Finland or these countries that regularly pop up like a game of whack-a-mole is that freedom of religion is a fundamental right, and it can't be subject to whatever whims that you feel at one given moment are don't fit in, or you regard as archaic or no longer progressive, or a remnant of an ancient faith that you believe is superstitious or whatever. And that applies also to kosher slaughter, for instance. I mean, Finland again, they were going to ban kosher slaughter, but allow hunting. So it's perfectly fine to run around shooting animals in the forest, but the moment that you try and shecht an animal, that becomes problematic. So we're fighting this legislation, and we're winning. And we're winning. I'm pleased to say it's not all a dark picture. Let's not, God forbid your listeners feel that there's no hope in Europe. There is hope, and we are making progress on these issues, and we are building fences, as our rabbis did around the mitzvot. We are building fences around freedom of religion, and making sure that in places like Poland and Finland and other places and Iceland, where coincidentally we managed to get that taken off the books and put aside, that's a success. Anti-Zionism is a whole different ballgame, because if you talk to Katharina von Schnurbein, she's a very smart lady. She will fight anti-Semitism tooth and nail. But you ask her, and you ask the European institutions to fight anti-Zionism, and they say, no, that's freedom of speech. And effectively, the anti-Semites have just moved the goalposts. They say, okay, we can't be anti-Semitic anymore because they got laws from it. But like a good lawyer who'll try and find loopholes in the law, they will try and find a loophole, and they say, okay, so we can be anti-Zionists instead. And
Alex, hasn't the European Union accepted the era definition of anti-Semitism, which also counts as anti-Semitic, to say that the state of Israel, the Jewish state, has no right to exist?
Yeah, they have, but of course it's unenforceable. It's a voluntary code. Mm-hmm. I mean, for instance, North Macedonia has also signed the arbitrary definition, and we had a case where one of our MPs of Jewish origin was subject to anti-Semitic abuse in the chamber. The arbitrary definition is voluntary. Yes, Europe has signed up to it, but on the problem that you've got is Europe has no say when it comes to foreign policy. Foreign policy is still decided by the member states itself. It can advise, but it can't compel.
But what surprises me is that somebody like Katharina von Schnurbein, who is the coordinator against anti-Semitism, for combating anti-Semitism, the European Commission, that she will say combating anti-Zionism, no.
It's not that she says no, she recognizes it, but it's not within her remit, because according to her bosses higher up the food chain in the European Commission and other places, Israel is a political issue, and Israel therefore is a foreign policy issue.
Oh,
Therefore, foreign policy falls under that particular window, and a lot of these groups are very, very clever, and they say, no, we don't have any problem with Jews, but we have a problem with Zionists. I mean, it's maybe it's different in the States. I know very, very few Zionists who aren't Jews. I know very, I don't know, and it seems odd to me that these countries and the very people that speak out about Israel are not speaking about other countries, but choose to target the world's only Jewish state.
Yeah.
That doesn't sit well with me, and it's just as far as I can see, and as far as we can see, this is just an excuse to talk about anti-Semitism via the back door.
Right.
I'd like to interject a question now. Do you have family background that particularly inspires you to do this work?
Sure. My family background. So I should say a couple of things. First of all, my mother wasn't Jewish, but I did the giyur, I did the conversion. My father was Jewish, and so that was that's going back a long, long time ago now. But on my father's side, my family were from Romania, and probably around about the same time that your family left Poland, I believe you said, was about the same time. Sorry,
Latvia and
Latvia,
Tiraspol and Odessa.
I beg your pardon. Although at that time the borders of
Yes.
Poland were somewhat fluid anyway, so my family would have been Romania, just as Romanian nationalism was starting to assert itself, and of course Romanian nationalism was intrinsically bound with anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So we ended up in the East End of London, and a lot of Benjamins actually ended up in Paris, and a lot of them sadly perished in the Holocaust as well. But because of the fact that we ended up in London, and presumably that you ended up in the United States, we found, Baruch Hashem, we found safe ground. But as well as that, I mean, you said I worked in Northern Ireland. You're right. I worked in politics. I worked for the Conservative Party as well in the United Kingdom for a while. I worked on the Unionist side in Northern Ireland, but it never felt personal to me in the way that my Judaism and my Zionism felt. And when I had the opportunity to come on board, my office in the European Parliament was effectively the de facto Jewish office in the European Parliament. The Jewish Advocacy organization would come in, Alex, do you mind if I dump my stuff? Can I use your desk or whatever? And then it only made sense for me to go into that world, and that's what I did, and I've been doing it ever since. And it seems like an odd thing to say considering the subjects that we're talking about, but I'm very proud. Do I love my job? No. Is it necessary? Absolutely. Do I feel proud to get up in the morning and do this for my kid and for my wife? Absolutely as well. Is it something that gives me great pleasure? Not particularly, but it's something that absolutely needs to be fought and done on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's certainly, it's certainly necessary, and we're grateful you're doing all that, giving your energy to this type of work. Could you explain to us a little more? I'm interested in if you manage to stop certain legislation, for instance, against circumcision or against kosher slaughter, or to create certain legislation in the interest of the Jewish people in Europe, how do you influence, how do you turn the opinion of the parliamentarians that have to vote about this, or the politicians?
It's a great and very perceptive question, and I'll give you the best answer that I can. Let me put it like this. There's probably 10% of people that get up in the morning in the parliament. I'll just give a European Parliament as an example, who are pro-Israel, fervently pro-Israel to the core. Now that can be because of foreign policy considerations, because they They believe Israel is a force for good in the world because they have they have their own personal animus towards Arab countries for historical reasons, or because of things post 9/11 or whatever, or because they're Christian and because they believe in that Israel needs to exist for the. I believe the Christians believe that Israel needs to be anyway something to do with the return of Jesus. And then on the other side, you've got the rabidly 15-20% who get up in the morning and hate everything Jewish and hate everything anything to do with Israel. Then you have this group in the middle, let's call them the 70%, who ebb and flow like the tide, who aren't really engaged on our issues. They understand that anti-Semitism is wrong. They don't really have that much knowledge about Israel, and they don't care. Why should they? Because they sit on the agriculture committee or they sit on the education committee. Those are the people that I'm really interested in reaching. How do we reach them? So for instance, on Israel, let me give you an example of how to reach them on Israel. So an agricultural guy from Spain, let's say there's a guy who's representing Spanish farmers in the south of Spain. Now, south of Spain has water problems, the same as Israel does. So we can talk to them about drip irrigation, and we can connect them with Israeli companies that are doing drip irrigation. And they think, wow, so I can grow my melon using 50% less water, using Israeli technology. And they feel great about Israel because Israel is actually, wow, those Jews, they're geniuses. They helped us out, and isn't that a wonderful thing? So that's one example. On anti-Semitism, we don't have to work too hard. People understand that anti-Semitism per se is wrong, and that's a good thing. On the anti-Zionism, it's much more problematic because anti-Semitism is something that is universally accepted as something that is wrong, and it's something that you're pushing an open door when you're pushing for legislation, except on issues like the Nazi memorabilia. It's a whole other conversation. You'd need a podcast on that specific subject for dealing with some of the legislative tools that we have for dealing with anti-Semitism. But this is how we try and reach people. We're trying to reach the people in the middle. The people that are on our side, it's not that they're not important. They need to be supported. They need to engage, and we keep them engaged, and we keep them busy in newsletters and campaigns and support and events. But for instance, with the politicians, we are constantly bringing, for instance, heads of education ministries to Auschwitz-Birkenau once a year. We have a symposium on combating anti-Semitism, what tools there are, what the trends are. We're constantly educating people to say, listen, this is important. It hasn't gone away. Your podcast is called Never Again Today, right?
Never
Never
Again
Again is now.
Never Again Now. Sorry.
Is now.
And that's kind of what we're doing. Our own strapline is not on my watch, and this is what we try and instill in the politicians. That be wary, be on your guard constantly. Not on my watch will we allow anti-Semitism to rise again.
Yeah, that's very good.
That's
Are you also, is your organization also putting efforts into educating the European population about Jews and Israel, or is it just directed at the politicians in Brussels?
It's not just directed at the politicians in Brussels, it's directed at the politicians and the diplomats across Europe. So we're dealing with every single parliament. Unfortunately, to do all of a population is extremely difficult, which is why we have our media arm as well, with which we do through briefings with experts and whatever. We bring them to talk to the journalists, and we hope to meet the public that way via the newspapers that they read or the broadcasts that they're watching. I wish we were big enough to do educational projects with the general public, but we're just not there yet. So it's primarily aimed at the key decision makers and arguably the opinion formers in Europe.
I'm going to ask you a question that maybe cannot be answered. And so let's say you're at a reception in Brussels and someone says an anti-Zionist thing to you. Are you prepared? I mean, have you practiced how to answer it? And can you share it with our audience? What do you say if someone says, I don't know, can you give us an example? You're holding a cocktail or wine and someone just says to you casually,
for instance, yeah, I mean, it's happened, like Israel. How do you feel about Israel killing children? That happens. Some people go out of your way to offend and say, well, and there are always arguments against, you can say, obviously, conflict like Gaza, it's a great shame there is no other army in the world like the Israel Defense Forces, which goes to pains to warn the civilian population that these things are happening. But when I flip it on them and I say, look, the problem is that Hamas are using children and the civilian population as human shields for launching attacks against Israel. And when Israel tries to, with pinpoint accuracy, most of the time, to take these people out, it can, of course, happen, but children are caught up in that. I mean, anti-Zionism happens a lot. At the same time, I end up as well sometimes with casual throwaway anti-Semitic remarks. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
So I worked in the European Parliament. As I said, I had this office. A young lady came into my office. She worked for an Italian delegation. This was a lady who was educated at the University of Bologna, one of the finest, oldest universities in Italy. She comes into my office because I used to have a sign in Hebrew. It was actually for an Israeli beer company, which my friends were running in Israel at the time. But she immediately knocked on the door. I don't wear a kippah on a daily basis. And she said, "You're Jewish?" I said, "Yes, I'm Jewish." So she closes the door. She said, "My father is having some business problems. And I heard that if a Jewish person curses somebody, it really works." Okay. And so I immediately start looking around, and I'm kind of half looking around for a hidden camera, as if some kind of, like hidden camera thing. And so, me being a bit of a smart aleck, I said, because I just wanted to disarm her. It was so ridiculous. So I said, "Yes, it's absolutely true, but it only works between Jews." This was my joke, my comeback. And she nodded her head sagely and said, "I understand, but it is true you can pick the sex of your own babies." Now, I ended up telling this girl just to get out of my office, and I was extremely offended, and I ended up reporting it to the Secretary General. There's a lot of stupidity and a lot of ignorance out there about Jews, and this is why the European Jewish Association exists, to bridge this gap in ignorance. In fact, we had the late great Shimon Peres a few years ago at an event, and somebody started bombarding him with some anti-Zionist remarks. And he said, "Let me stop you there. There are many gaps in your ignorance, and we try." And he said it in such a beautiful way as well. I really do miss Shimon Peres. What a great man he was. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to fill a lot of these ignorance gaps, and it's difficult, of course. And I'm aware I don't want to, drag on too long for your audience, but we are aware as well that when you come to Europe, I don't know how often you've seen it, but obviously Evelyn knows this from her experience in Holland. Most Jewish community, we say to people, "Where's the synagogue?" and look for the concrete bollards outside, look for the police guards, look for the army outside. Most Jewish communities are hidden from the public. We want these communities out front and center, proud, talking about the contributions that Jews have made over millennia. We just celebrated Shavuot, the 10 Commandments. We gave the world the 10 Commandments, the basis, the ethical and moral foundation on which most of Western civilization is built comes from the Jewish people. And we should be incredibly proud of that heritage. We should be incredibly proud of that background. Unfortunately, it's hidden too often behind synagogue doors heavily guarded by the army and the police. This we want to change. We want a proud Judaism, a Judaism that's proud to be front and center, and a kind of Judaism that exists in the States with our colleagues in places like APAC. We deal a lot with APAC and you've got the American Jewish Committee, and these are great organizations that Jews, you know, whenever I go to Washington, D.C., pre-pandemic, I used to go to APAC. Wow, it gave me so much energy seeing Jews walking around proudly in the streets wearing kippot. I can imagine it's not even an issue to walk around LA in a kippah. Now, there are some streets in Brussels that I can't walk up wearing a kippah. It would not be worth my while. Sometimes on Kippur, I wear my obviously on Shabbat and Kippur on holidays, I wear my kippah, and I can already see it's a completely different experience. Me walking up the street in Brussels wearing a kippah and not wearing a kippah. You can see people looking. You can see a couple of comments here and there. Regarde un juif, they say. Look, a Jew. You know, it's not a good. It's not a good feel good place to feel Jewish, but we're working on changing that.
Yeah. And from what I understand, you try to change that through legislation, through the legislative bodies. Is that correct?
To an extent, but it's also through education. I mean, you know, you can't really legislate on education. There are something. So when it comes to education, it's concrete example. People learn about the Shoah, and it's extremely important that they learn about the Shoah. But the Jewish totality of the experience should never just be defined by the Shoah itself. And we try and reform curriculums in schools. So for instance, I spoke earlier on about Rabbi Jacobs, Rav Jacobs.
Yeah.
He's been in Holland for, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 generations. He's probably more Dutch than most Dutch people. And he's frequently asked, he just asked last week in Amersfoort, you probably know it. And he was asked, how long have you been in Holland? Okay. There's always this idea of a Jew as being other, as never being part of a country. And some of the greatest thinkers, economists, agrarians, scientists in every European country have come from a Jewish background. And we want that in curriculums. We want that reflected, not just that they think of Jews as a Holocaust. Of course, the Holocaust is something terrible, and it absolutely should be taught. And and I'll get it right. I'll get it right. It was never again now, right?
Never again is now.
Is now.
Is now. And so never again is now, right? But we also need to we need to educate, and we need the ministers of education. We need the people sitting on the education committees. We need those tasked with educating the children in Europe that Jews aren't other, that we're not separate. We are an inherent part of the European social, intellectual, economic fabric, and that we are often part of the very national narratives in which they feel proud of their own countries. But that story isn't being told enough. And right. That's what we're working on.
Yeah. Yes, and from what my understanding is that Jews and Judaism become more and more invisible in European education. It's not even discussed.
Well,
right?
Yeah, there's that as well. I mean, for instance, it's virtually impossible in France today to talk about Jews and Judaism, because there'll be the Muslim parents will complain about it, and it's happening. France is a particular example because they believe strongly in this concept of what's called laïcité, which is the real strong separation of church and state. But having said that, you've got, for instance, I don't know if I'm sure you're aware. I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners will be aware of the case of Samuel Paty in France. This was a French teacher who wanted to discuss the issues surrounding Charlie Hebdo and also what happened in the Bataclan and Hypercacher in Paris. He ended up showing the example of what Charlie Hebdo did with the caricature of the Prophet Muhammad. He was decapitated by Samuel Paty. He was decapitated after one of the students complained, and he ended up being killed. You can't talk about Judaism and Jews in certain classrooms in Europe for risk of offending the Muslim population. That's the way it is, sadly. And there's no point in me trying to dress it up any other way. That's exactly what it is. And you know, some people will say to me, "You can't say that," but sometimes it just has to be said. Yeah. Because Judaism is intrinsically linked with Israel, and Israel is intrinsically linked with Judaism, and Jews and Israel, and it's humiliation, the Nakba. All of these things are intertwined, and this is the kind of conflation that you get. Obviously, as well, most recognizably Jewish kids go to Jewish schools, so they're not interacting with and the honest answer is there aren't that many Jews in Europe. There aren't that many Jews in Europe. Yeah. So my daughter goes to the European school. It's not a Jewish school. She doesn't eat pork. She doesn't eat shellfish. They know she's Jewish. I take her out for the Jewish holidays. That dispensation is allowed. But in her class, she's the only Jewish girl with out of, I don't know, 50 other kids, of which maybe 20 will be Muslim. So, you know, I mean, straight off the bat, we're in a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Alex, this has been such a fascinating conversation. We're coming to the end of our time. So, and we were going to ask you, so I'm going to offer you last thoughts, but in the last thoughts, could you say whether there's anything that our listeners could do to help with the European Jewish Association's work? So could you wrap that into your last thoughts?
Sure. So I mean, I don't want it to sound self-promoting, but obviously if people would like to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and obviously keep an eye on our work and keep an eye on our campaigns, and magnify that, and also talk about the issues that we're talking about. I mean, one of the big, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but one of the big campaigns that we're pushing at the moment, there are a number of national plans coming out for combating anti-Semitism. And in fact, there may even be one in the States. I don't know. I think President Biden has been talking about one.
It was just released.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know what's in the American plan, but I can tell you that in most of the European plans, anti-Semitism has been thrown in the mix with LGBTQ, has been thrown in with Roma, has been thrown in with racism, has been thrown in. We want anti-Semitism treated on its own. There is no one cure for all cancers, and anti-Semitism is a cancer which needs to be treated on its own. So I would really ask your viewers, listeners, to, if they are talking with politicians, if they are engaging with their representatives, to say to them that anti-Semitism mustn't be thrown in to this intersectional mix where, in any case, most Black people regard Jews as privileged, and our form of anti-Semitism is not discrimination in their eyes. LGBTQ groups can't stand to see a Magen David on a rainbow background accuse Jews of pink washing in Tel Aviv, being one of the most openly gay-friendly cities in Europe. So there is no intersectionality. This idea of that somehow we're all in it together is a nonsense from the outset. Even amongst the hated, Jews are hated. So we need that separation. So that's what we're really, that's a real campaign that we're pushing for at the moment. Don't throw anti-Semitism in the mix with all of these other forms of hatred. It needs its own approach. It needs its own medicine. It needs its own treatment.
That's really an effective end to this episode. It's what Evelyn and I are trying to do. And we so thank you, Alex, for coming on our show and helping us to do that. We thank our listeners. For those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, it's on Amazon and YouTube. You can learn more about my nonfiction Holocaust play at Thin Edge of the Wedge. And as we end every show, we say, without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.
Amen.